Intelligence is often mistaken for resilience, but under pressure it can become a liability rather than an advantage. And the tragedy of Waterloo begins precisely here, with the illusion that being smart is enough when the world starts collapsing around you. Napoleon Bonaparte did not arrive at Waterloo as a foolish man, an unprepared man, or an inexperienced commander. He arrived as one of the most intellectually formidable strategists in human history, a man who had rewritten warfare through speed, geometry, logistics, and psychological dominance. Yet intelligence without internal control is like a sharp blade in a shaking hand, dangerous, not because it lacks power, but because it cannot be wielded steadily when pressure distorts perception. Smart people build their identity around being right, being prepared, and being ahead of others. And that identity works beautifully in stable environments where time is available, information is clear, and consequences are manageable. But pressure destroys stability, compresses time, distorts information, and magnifies consequences, forcing the mind to operate in a mode it was never trained for. If intelligence was mistaken for adaptability, at Waterloo, Napoleon's intelligence was intact, but the conditions that once allowed his brilliance to dominate no longer existed. He was physically unwell, mentally fatigued, and operating under extreme time pressure against adaptive enemies, who had learned from his earlier victories. This is the moment where smart people fail not because they lack solutions, but because their solutions are built for yesterday's conditions. Intelligence loves patterns. It thrives on familiarity. It depends on recognizing what has worked before and applying it again with refinement. Under pressure, however, reality mutates faster than patterns can be recognized. And the smarter the individual, the more likely they are to cling to familiar frameworks rather than accept that the environment has fundamentally changed. Napoleon had won countless battles by decisive early strikes and aggressive maneuvering. But at Waterloo, terrain, weather, coalition timing, and his own physical condition disrupted the very patterns his intelligence relied upon. Instead of adapting instantly, his mind hesitated not from stupidity, but from the burden of too much experience, insisting that past methods should still work. This is the illusion of smartness, the belief that accumulated knowledge automatically translates into dominance under stress. In reality, knowledge becomes heavy when speed is required. Smart people tend to simulate outcomes internally before acting, running mental models, evaluating second and third-order consequences. But pressure punishes simulation because it steals time and clarity. Under pressure, the brain shifts from analytical processing to survival processing. Cortisol floods the system. Fine reasoning degrades. Attention narrows. Emotional signals override logic. For someone whose identity is built on thinking, this shift feels disorienting and threatening. The mind resists it. Instead of surrendering to adaptive instinct, smart people attempt to force rational control back into a situation that no longer supports it. Napoleon's hesitation at Waterloo was not ignorance. It was resistance to a new reality that did not match his internal models. He delayed, recalculated, waited for optimal conditions, believing that intelligence could still outmaneuver chaos. But chaos does not wait. Pressure is unforgiving. It does not reward the smartest plan. It rewards the fastest viable move. Smart people often underestimate this because their past success taught them that thinking harder leads to better outcomes. Under pressure, thinking harder often leads to paralysis. The more variables you see, the harder it becomes to commit. Napoleon saw everything: the terrain softened by rain, the timing of reinforcements, the risk of premature assault, the possibility of counterattack, and this omniscience slowed him. His enemies, less burdened by the weight of legendary expectation and intellectual perfection, moved with simpler intent. This is another critical aspect of the Waterloo Effect. Intelligence increases awareness, but awareness under pressure becomes noise if it is not paired with decisiveness. The smarter you are, the more you notice what can go wrong, and under pressure, the mind exaggerates threats. Risk assessment becomes risk obsession. Napoleon's earlier campaigns thrive on boldness, but boldness requires emotional regulation. Under extreme pressure, emotional regulation fractures, and intelligence alone cannot repair it. Smart people often lack training in emotional dominance because their intellect has always compensated for emotional strain. They believe control comes from understanding. Under pressure, control comes from acceptance. Acceptance that conditions are imperfect. Acceptance that information is incomplete. Acceptance that mistakes are unavoidable. Napoleon struggled here because his identity was no longer just that of a general. It was that of a genius whose myth demanded precision. The pressure to live up to his own legend constrained him. Smart people suffer from this more than others. Their past success becomes a psychological prison. They fear making the wrong move more than making no move at all. Under pressure, this fear is fatal. Waterloo exposed this vulnerability. Napoleon's intelligence had previously allowed him to bend reality to his will. At Waterloo, reality pushed back harder than ever, and intelligence without flexibility cracked. Another reason smart people fail under pressure is that they overtrust preparation. Preparation creates confidence, but pressure introduces variables no preparation can fully account for. Napoleon prepared extensively, but pressure reshaped the battlefield minute by minute. Weather altered terrain, delays altered timing, allies altered plans, enemies adapted. Intelligence wants predictability. Pressure destroys it. When predictability disappears, smart people often try to restore it artificially by waiting, reassessing, or seeking confirmation. This delay compounds pressure. Less intelligent, but more instinctive actors move forward, exploiting momentum. Momentum is invisible to intellect, but obvious to instinct. Napoleon once mastered momentum, but at Waterloo, his connection to instinct was weakened by fatigue and expectation. This reveals a brutal truth. Intelligence must be paired with physical and emotional readiness to function under pressure. When the body is compromised, the mind follows. Smart people often neglect this because their success has taught them that thinking is enough. Waterloo proved that thinking without physical and emotional stability collapses. Napoleon was ill, exhausted, and constrained by time. His intelligence remained sharp, but his capacity to deploy it dynamically was reduced. Under pressure, the smartest plan executed delayed is worse than a flawed plan executed immediately. Smart people struggle with this trade-off because their identity values correctness over speed. Pressure values speed over correctness. This mismatch creates failure. The Waterloo Effect, at its core, is the moment when intelligence refuses to downgrade itself for survival. Napoleon's mind was still operating at a high level, but the environment demanded brutal simplicity. Simplicity feels like regression to smart people. They equate it with laziness or incompetence. Under pressure, simplicity is adaptation. Napoleon hesitated to simplify. His enemies did not. They focus on timing, coordination, and endurance rather than brilliance. Another factor is that smart people often underestimate how pressure affects others. Napoleon assumed his opponents would break psychologically as they had before. He underestimated their resilience because intelligence often leads to projection, assuming others will react as they should based on logic. Pressure scrambles logic. His enemies did not behave as expected. They held ground longer. They adapted faster. This shattered his predictive models. When predictions fail under pressure, smart people experience cognitive dissonance. They either adapt instantly or cling to outdated assumptions. Clinging is easier. Napoleon clung longer than he should have. This was not stupidity. It was the inertia of intelligence. Intelligence builds complex frameworks. Frameworks resist collapse. Pressure demands collapse and rebuild in real time. That skill is not taught by intellect alone. It is forged by repeated exposure to uncertainty without the safety net of analysis. Waterloo stripped Napoleon of that net. His intelligence became heavy armor in a battlefield that required agility. This is why smart people often fail catastrophically rather than gradually. Their systems work until they don't. When they fail suddenly because they are not accustomed to operating without their intellectual tools. Less intelligent, but more adaptable individuals degrade more gracefully. They adjust instinctively. Napoleon's downfall at Waterloo illustrates this asymmetry. His intelligence was not gone. Its environment was. Smart people fail under pressure because they confuse knowing with controlling. Pressure cannot be controlled. It must be ridden. Intelligence wants mastery. Pressure demands surrender to flow. Napoleon had mastered mastery. At Waterloo, he needed flow. This mismatch sealed the outcome. The illusion of smartness is believing that thinking harder will always save you. Waterloo teaches the opposite lesson. Under pressure, the mind must become quieter, not louder. Intelligence must step back and allow decisiveness, instinct, and adaptability to lead. Napoleon could not fully make that shift in time. The result was not just a lost battle, but a permanent lesson in human psychology. Brilliance without internal control collapses. When pressure becomes absolute, pressure does not simply make situations harder. It fundamentally rewires the way the human mind functions. And this is the invisible trap that swallows even the smartest individuals. When stakes rise beyond familiar limits, a trap Napoleon himself walked into at Waterloo without fully realizing its grip. Under pressure, the brain does not think faster or focus harder as many intelligent people assume. Instead, it shifts operational modes entirely, abandoning expansive strategic reasoning in favor of narrow survival processing. And the tragedy is that smart people often fight the shift rather than adapt to it. When stress intensifies, cortisol and adrenaline flood the system, shrinking working memory, compressing attention, and prioritizing immediate threats over long-range planning. This biological response evolved to help humans survive predators, not to manage complex, multivariable decisions under time constraints. Intelligence thrives in environments where the brain can access broad context, compare scenarios, and weigh trade-offs. Pressure destroys that environment. Napoleon entered Waterloo carrying not only the weight of battle, but the accumulated stress of exile, return, illness, fatigue, and the psychological burden of reclaiming a shattered empire. His mind was still sharp, but it was operating under biochemical conditions that narrowed perception and distorted judgment. This is the pressure trap, when the mind insists on behaving as if conditions are normal, while the body is screaming that they are not. Smart people fall into this trap because their success has conditioned them to trust cognition. Above all else, they believe thinking is the solution to every problem. Under pressure, thinking becomes the problem. The smarter the individual, the more violent the internal conflict becomes when cognitive clarity begins to erode. Instead of simplifying, they attempt to compensate by thinking harder, analyzing more deeply, and controlling every variable. This only accelerates cognitive overload. Napoleon's decision-making at Waterloo shows signs of this overload. He delayed, recalculated, reassessed, not because he lacked courage, but because pressure had fragmented his internal signal-to-noise ratio. Stress amplifies irrelevant details and suppresses critical ones. Terrain conditions, weather delays, coalition timing all were important, but pressure magnified their perceived risk until action felt dangerous rather than necessary. This is how pressure rewrites the mind. It reframes risk avoidance as intelligence. Smart people mistake caution for wisdom under stress, when in reality, stress has hijacked their threat perception. Napoleon had previously thrived by embracing calculated risk, but under extreme pressure, his risk tolerance collapsed. This is not a moral failure. It is a neurological one. Under sustained stress, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of strategic planning, loses dominance to more primitive brain regions focused on threat detection. This shift makes long-term consequences feel abstract and immediate dangers feel overwhelming. Napoleon's mind, once expansive and aggressive, became compressed and defensive. He still saw the board, but he no longer felt in control of it. Pressure also distorts time perception. Minutes feel shorter. Delays feel catastrophic. Opportunities feel fleeting yet dangerous. Smart people are particularly vulnerable to this distortion because they rely heavily on timing precision. Under pressure, they become hyper-aware of lost time, which paradoxically makes them hesitate further as they try to get it right. Napoleon's delayed engagement at Waterloo reflects this paradox. The longer he waited, the more pressure accumulated, and the more pressure accumulated, the harder it became to commit. This feedback loop is lethal. Pressure rewards early commitment and punishes late perfectionism. Smart people often reverse this order. They seek perfection before commitment. Under pressure, this is fatal. Another way pressure rewrites the mind is by collapsing flexibility. Stress narrows not just attention, but imagination. Alternative strategies feel less accessible. Adaptation slows. Napoleon was facing enemies who had learned from his earlier tactics. Yet pressure made it harder for him to abandon those tactics entirely. Stress favors habit. Habit feels safe. Smart people often have highly refined habits built on past success. Under pressure, they cling to them, even when conditions demand innovation. This is the pressure trap's cruel irony. The very expertise that once ensured dominance becomes rigidity. Napoleon's brilliance had crystallized into a style of warfare that pressure made difficult to abandon. His enemies, less burdened by identity and expectation, adapted more freely. Stress also alters emotional regulation. Under pressure, emotions surface faster and are harder to suppress. Smart people are accustomed to emotional control through understanding. They regulate emotion cognitively by explaining it to themselves. Under extreme stress, this mechanism breaks down. Emotion bypasses explanation. Frustration, irritation, and anxiety leak into decision-making. Napoleon's irritability and impatience during the campaign reflected this erosion. Emotional leakage under pressure leads to miscommunication, strained command relationships, and reduced trust. Stress rewrites social perception as well. Under pressure, the mind becomes more suspicious, less collaborative, more prone to misinterpreting others' actions as threats or incompetence. Napoleon's relationships with his commanders suffered under this strain. Smart people often expect others to perform at their level under pressure. When they don't, frustration grows. Frustration further degrades judgment. This creates a downward spiral where intelligence becomes isolated rather than leveraged. Pressure also magnifies identity threat. Napoleon was not merely fighting an army. He was fighting the possibility that his legend might end. Identity threat is one of the most powerful stressors known to psychology. When identity is threatened, the mind prioritizes self-preservation over objective optimization. Decisions become defensive, aimed at protecting self-image rather than maximizing outcome. Smart people, whose identities are tightly bound to competence, are especially vulnerable. They fear making visible mistakes more than making invisible delays. Napoleon's caution can be read through this lens. The cost of a bold failure felt higher than the cost of waiting. Pressure warped his cost-benefit analysis. Stress also reduces learning speed. Under pressure, the brain struggles to integrate new information. It relies on pre-existing schemas. This makes adaptation slower precisely when speed is required. Napoleon received new information throughout the battle, but pressure limited his ability to update strategy dynamically. Smart people often believe they can think their way out of stress. In reality, stress must be managed physiologically and emotionally before cognition can function optimally. Napoleon's physical illness compounded his stress response, further impairing cognitive flexibility. This highlights a critical, but often ignored truth. Mental performance under pressure is inseparable from physical state. Intelligence alone cannot override exhaustion, pain, or illness. Smart people often neglect this, believing willpower can compensate. Waterloo proved otherwise. Pressure also alters memory retrieval. Under stress, access to nuanced knowledge becomes harder. The mind retrieves simplified versions of past experiences. Napoleon's recall of previous victories may have felt less actionable. Under the chaotic conditions of Waterloo, this creates a sense of disorientation. Smart people rely on memory patterns to guide decisions. When those patterns feel inaccessible or unreliable, confidence erodes. Eroded confidence under pressure leads to either reckless overcompensation or paralyzing caution. Napoleon leaned toward caution. The pressure trap also involves social pressure. Napoleon was not operating in isolation. He was aware of how his decisions would be judged by history, allies, enemies, and himself. Social evaluation pressure amplifies stress dramatically. Smart people are often highly sensitive to evaluation because their value has long been tied to performance. Under pressure, this sensitivity becomes a distraction. Instead of focusing solely on the task, part of the mind monitors reputation risk. This split attention degrades performance. Waterloo was not just a military engagement. It was a referendum on Napoleon's identity. That weight altered his mental state. Pressure also changes how failure is perceived. Under normal conditions, failure is a learning opportunity. Under pressure, failure feels existential. Smart people accustomed to learning through failure struggle when failure threatens identity or survival. Napoleon had little margin for error. This heightened the stakes beyond tactical considerations. High stakes compress decision windows. Compressed windows demand simplicity. Napoleon's intelligence sought complexity. This mismatch widened under pressure. Hesitation is not the absence of intelligence. It is the paralysis created when intelligence overloads itself under pressure. And at Waterloo, this paralysis became fatal, not because Napoleon lacked options, but because he saw too many of them at the worst possible moment. Advantage in conflict is always temporary. It exists in windows small, fragile windows that close without warning, and the cruel truth is that pressure does not forgive those who wait for certainty before acting. Napoleon had advantages early at Waterloo, positional opportunities, experienced troops, and a chance to strike before enemy coordination fully solidified. Yet he delayed, and that delay did not come from cowardice or ignorance, but from a mind struggling to reconcile imperfect conditions with a lifetime of precision-driven success. Smart people hesitate because they are trained to optimize, and optimization requires comparison. Comparison requires time. Pressure does not give time. Under pressure, the environment moves faster than the mind can finish evaluating. Napoleon hesitated because he was still thinking in a world where thinking first had always paid off. Waterloo was not that world. The rain-softened ground, the delayed cavalry, the uncertainty of reinforcements, these factors triggered a cognitive trap, where waiting felt responsible and acting felt reckless. This is the fatal misunderstanding of pressure. Under pressure, delay is often the most reckless choice of all. Hesitation hands initiative to the opponent. Initiative is invisible when you have it and devastating when you lose it. Napoleon had built his legend on seizing initiative early, forcing enemies to react to him. At Waterloo, hesitation reversed that dynamic. By waiting, he allowed enemies to stabilize, coordinate, and adapt. This is the invisible cost of delay. It does not merely pause action. It actively strengthens the opposition. Smart people often underestimate this compounding effect because they evaluate decisions in isolation rather than in motion. Under pressure, motion is everything. The battlefield does not freeze while you think. Reality continues to evolve. Napoleon's hesitation created a temporal gap that his enemies filled. They used the time he gave them to reposition, reinforce, and harden their resolve. This transformed a manageable situation into a crisis. Hesitation also alters internal perception. The longer a decision is delayed, the heavier it feels. Doubt accumulates. Each passing minute adds psychological weight, making commitment increasingly difficult. This creates a feedback loop where delay breeds doubt, and doubt breeds further delay. Napoleon became trapped in this loop. His early caution felt justified, but as time passed, that same caution began to feel like indecision. Under pressure, the mind becomes aware of its own hesitation, which increases anxiety. Anxiety further degrades decisiveness. This spiral is devastating for intelligent individuals because they are acutely aware of what is being lost. Awareness without action becomes torment. Napoleon likely sensed momentum slipping away, which intensified pressure and further impaired his ability to act decisively. Hesitation under pressure also distorts risk assessment. Early risks feel manageable. Delayed risks feel catastrophic. Napoleon may have judged an early attack as risky, but by waiting, he allowed risks to multiply. The terrain worsened. Enemy positions strengthened. Reinforcements approached. The same action that once carried moderate risk now carried extreme risk. This escalation is the silent tax of hesitation. Smart people miscalculate this because they treat risk as static rather than dynamic. Under pressure, risk grows with time. Delay does not preserve safety. It erodes it. Napoleon's delay transformed a calculated gamble into a desperate move. When he finally committed, conditions were far worse than they had been earlier. This reinforces a brutal lesson. Under pressure, acting imperfectly early is often safer than acting perfectly late. Smart people struggle with this because their identity is built on minimizing error. They would rather delay than risk visible failure. Under pressure, this preference is punished. The environment rewards those who accept imperfection in exchange for momentum. Napoleon's earlier victories were built on this principle. At Waterloo, he deviated from it. Hesitation also fractures command coherence. When leaders delay, subordinates sense uncertainty. Confidence leaks downward. Orders lose urgency. Execution becomes cautious rather than aggressive. Napoleon's delay affected troop morale and coordination. Soldiers respond to decisiveness. It provides clarity and purpose. Hesitation breeds confusion. Confusion slows action. Under pressure, slow execution compounds strategic delay. Even when Napoleon eventually ordered attacks, they lacked the sharpness of his earlier campaigns. This was not because his soldiers were weak, but because hesitation at the top rippled through the entire system. Smart leaders often underestimate how sensitive systems are to their timing. They assume subordinates will compensate. Under pressure, subordinates amplify hesitation rather than absorb it. The system reflects the leader's internal state. Napoleon's internal conflict manifested externally. Hesitation also invites external interference. By delaying, Napoleon allowed enemy forces time to arrive and intervene. This is a key dynamic of pressure situations. Delay opens doors you cannot close later. Under pressure, the environment is hostile and opportunistic. It exploits hesitation mercilessly. Napoleon's enemies did not need brilliance. They needed time. His hesitation gave it to them. This underscores another painful truth. Intelligence does not defeat pressure. Timing does. Timing is brutal. It does not care how smart you are, only whether you moved when the window was open. Napoleon missed critical windows. Smart people often miss windows because they are busy evaluating them. Pressure closes windows while you think. Hesitation also reshapes self-perception. Each delayed decision reinforces a narrative of uncertainty. The leader begins to doubt his own instincts. This self-doubt further slows decision-making. Napoleon, once instinctively bold, became increasingly cautious as the day progressed. This shift was subtle, but decisive. Boldness early creates confidence later. Hesitation early creates fear later. Fear narrows options further. This is why hesitation is not neutral, it is corrosive. It eats away at psychological resilience. Smart people often believe they can wait and see under pressure. Waiting reveals more threats than opportunities. Napoleon waited, and what he saw increasingly discouraged action. Hesitation also creates asymmetry. While one side waits, the other side moves. Movement creates learning. Learning improves adaptation. Napoleon's enemies learned as the battle unfolded. Napoleon, stuck in hesitation, learned slower. This learning asymmetry widened over time. By the time he fully committed, his opponents were better positioned and more psychologically prepared. This is another hidden cost of delay. It deprives you of real-time feedback. Action generates information. Inaction generates speculation. Speculation is less reliable. Napoleon relied on speculation longer than he should have. Under pressure, speculation feels safer than action, but it is far more dangerous. Hesitation also interacts with pressure to distort memory. Leaders recall past failures more vividly under stress. Napoleon may have been haunted by the consequences of miscalculation. This retrospective fear made him cautious. Smart people carry detailed memories of failure. Under pressure, these memories resurface and influence decisions disproportionately. The mind overweights negative outcomes to avoid repeating them. This bias is adaptive in low-stakes environments, but destructive in high-stakes, fast-moving ones. Napoleon's caution may have been shaped by such memories. Pressure amplifies loss aversion. Loss aversion fuels hesitation. Hesitation fuels defeat. The Waterloo Effect is not about making the wrong decision. It is about making decisions too late. Napoleon's intelligence did not fail him in content, it failed him in timing. His plans were not absurd. They were misstimed. Pressure punishes mistiming brutally. The battlefield does not negotiate with intelligence. It responds only to movement. Napoleon's delay surrendered movement. Once initiative was lost, regaining it required overwhelming force, which he no longer had. This is the final cruelty of hesitation. It raises the cost of action beyond affordability. Early action is cheap. Late action is expensive. Napoleon faced escalating costs. When he finally moved, the price was too high. This dynamic applies far beyond warfare. In business, leadership, crisis response, and life, smart people often wait too long, believing more information will save them. Under pressure, information arrives slower than consequences. Waterloo teaches that under pressure, the decision to decide is more important than the decision itself. Napoleon hesitated, and that hesitation rewrote history, not because he was wrong, but because he was late. The most dangerous moment for any intelligent person under pressure is not when options disappear, but when identity takes control of decision-making, because at that point you are no longer responding to reality, you are defending who you believe yourself to be. And Waterloo was not simply a military defeat for Napoleon. It was a collision between reality and a legend that had grown too powerful to adapt. Identity is a double-edged weapon. It gives confidence, coherence, and direction, but under pressure, it hardens into rigidity. Napoleon was not just a commander at Waterloo. He was Napoleon the Conqueror, the strategist, the man whose name alone had reshaped Europe. This identity had served him brilliantly for years, but under extreme pressure, it became a psychological cage. Smart people often fail not because they lack intelligence, but because they are trapped by their past success. The more successful a person becomes, the more invested they are in a specific self-image, and the higher the psychological cost of acting in ways that contradict that image. At Waterloo, Napoleon faced a battlefield that demanded adaptation, humility, and deviation from his established patterns. But deviation would have meant admitting, if only to himself, that his old methods might not fully apply. Under pressure, the mind resists this admission fiercely. Identity preservation becomes more important than outcome optimization. This is the core of the Waterloo Effect. Napoleon's earlier victories had conditioned him to trust certain rhythms, decisive central strikes, aggressive timing, psychological dominance through momentum. These patterns had become part of who he was. When the battlefield conditions disrupted those patterns, instead of abandoning them quickly, he attempted to force reality to conform to his identity. This is a fatal move under pressure. Reality does not bend to reputation. It bends only to adaptation. Smart people often struggle here because their intelligence is intertwined with their self-concept. Being the smartest, the best strategist, or the most capable becomes not just a skill set, but an identity that must be protected. Under pressure, protecting identity feels safer than risking ego injury, even if the latter will lead to better outcomes. Napoleon's hesitation, misjudgments, and delayed commitments were not isolated errors. They were symptoms of an internal conflict between who he had been and what the moment required. Identity creates expectations not just from others, but from oneself. Napoleon was expected to dominate, to outmaneuver effortlessly, to win through brilliance. These expectations create pressure that narrows perception. Instead of seeing the battlefield as it was, Napoleon may have subconsciously filtered information through the lens of how a Napoleon style victory should look. This filtering blinds leaders to unconventional solutions. Smart people often ignore viable options, simply because those options do not align with their established narrative. Under pressure, narrative consistency becomes seductive. It feels stabilizing, but it is also limiting. The Waterloo battlefield demanded flexibility and improvisation. Napoleon's identity favored control and orchestration. This mismatch created friction. Identity also amplifies fear of failure. Failure threatens not just the outcome, but the story. For Napoleon, defeat was not merely loss, it was identity collapse. Under such stakes, the mind becomes conservative in strange ways. Instead of bold adaptation, it clings to familiar strategies because familiarity reinforces identity continuity. Smart people often mistake this clinging for discipline or consistency. In reality, it is fear-driven rigidity. Waterloo exposed this rigidity. Napoleon did not lack courage. He lacked psychological distance from his own legend. Distance allows objectivity. Without it, leaders become actors in their own myth rather than observers of reality. Under pressure, this myth consumes cognitive resources. Energy is spent maintaining self-image rather than reading the environment accurately. Napoleon's decisions were burdened by symbolic weight. Each move had to feel like Napoleon. This added invisible constraints. Identity also distorts feedback processing. Leaders deeply attached to identity selectively interpret information. That confirms their self-concept. Contradictory signals are downplayed or rationalized. At Waterloo, warning signs accumulated. Delays, coordination issues, environmental constraints, enemy resilience. These signals required recalibration. Identity resistance slowed this recalibration. Smart people often pride themselves on consistency, but under pressure, consistency becomes a liability when conditions shift. The Waterloo Effect teaches that intelligence without identity flexibility becomes fragility. The stronger the identity, the harder it is to pivot. Napoleon's enemies benefited not from superior brilliance, but from psychological freedom. They were not constrained by legend. They could respond pragmatically. Napoleon, ironically, was constrained by his own greatness. Identity also shapes command culture. Subordinates often mirror the leader's self-concept. If the leader's identity is rigid, the organization becomes rigid. At Waterloo, this rigidity manifested in execution delays and reduced initiative at lower levels. Soldiers and commanders waited for cues that fit the established style. This slowed adaptation. Under pressure, decentralized adaptation is critical. Identity-centric leadership suppresses it. Napoleon's centralized brilliance had worked in the past, but under Waterloo's conditions, it limited responsiveness. This is another layer of the Waterloo Effect when identity-driven leadership encounters complex, rapidly evolving pressure. It becomes brittle. Smart people often overlook this because their past success validates their style. Success reinforces identity. Identity resists change. Pressure exposes the cost. Identity also affects emotional regulation. Leaders invested in identity experience threats more intensely. Each setback feels personal. This emotional load degrades cognitive performance. Napoleon's emotional state at Waterloo likely fluctuated as events deviated from expectation. Emotional strain narrows focus and increases tunnel vision. Under pressure, this tunnel vision blocks peripheral awareness. Smart people often believe they can compartmentalize emotion. Under extreme pressure, this belief collapses. Identity-linked emotion seeps into decision-making. The more central identity is, the harder it is to separate emotion from analysis. Waterloo illustrates that even the most formidable minds are vulnerable here. Identity also delays acceptance of loss. When identity is tied to winning, leaders resist acknowledging when the battle has turned. This resistance leads to sunk cost escalation. Resources are committed not because they are strategically optimal, but because retreat threatens identity. Napoleon's late-stage decisions reflected this dynamic. Rather than cutting losses early, he continued to push within a deteriorating situation. Under pressure, smart people often double down to protect self-image. This accelerates failure. The Waterloo Effect is thus not a story of incompetence, but of over-identification. Napoleon was too closely fused with his role. He could not step outside himself fast enough. The lesson is brutal, but clear. Under pressure, identity must become fluid. The ability to detach from self-image, reputation, and past success is a decisive advantage. Those who cannot detach will be outpaced by those who can. Intelligence amplifies this risk because intelligent people build stronger identities around their intellect. They trust their patterns. They expect consistency from reality. Pressure breaks consistency. Waterloo was a reminder that the environment always has the final vote. Identity does not negotiate with terrain, timing, or chance. It either adapts or collapses. Napoleon's collapse was not immediate. It was gradual, psychological, and rooted in identity conflict. The Waterloo Effect applies everywhere smart people operate under pressure: boardrooms, crises, leadership roles, life decisions. When pressure rises, the question is not what would someone like me do, but what does this situation require right now? Those who ask the first question fail. Those who ask the second survive. Napoleon asked the first for too long. By the time he asked the second, the window had closed. This is the final lesson of Waterloo. Intelligence wins battles, but identity flexibility wins wars.